My thumb hovered over the trash icon for almost a full minute before I finally pressed it. And even after the little app icon shivered and vanished from my home screen, I sat there in my truck in the church parking lot for another 10 minutes, just staring at the empty space where it used to be. Like deleting it might not be enough. Like something that had lived inside my phone for a year might still find a way back in. My name is Harold. I'm 44 years old. I work as an insurance claims adjuster here in Tulsa, and for the past 13 years I've been married to a woman named Carol, a hospital administrator with a laugh I fell for at a mutual friend's cookout back when we were both in our early 30s and neither of us had any idea what the next decade and a half would ask of us. I want to tell you about the app first, because that's where this story actually starts, even though I didn't understand what I was looking at until almost a year after I first opened it. It began as what I told myself was harmless curiosity, a moment of weakness on a slow Tuesday night, scrolling through my phone after Carol had gone to bed, when a targeted ad for a dating app called Spark Connect showed up in my feed. Of all things, despite the fact that I was a married man who had no business clicking on it. I clicked anyway. I told myself it was just to see what the fuss was about, the way you slowed down driving past an accident on the highway. I never expected to actually create a profile. I definitely never expected someone named Emily to message me within the first week, sweet and funny and interested in exactly the kind of things I liked talking about, in a way that felt, God help me, like being seen. I didn't tell Carol. That's the first thing I have to admit plainly, because everything else in this story sits on top of that one omission. I told myself it wasn't cheating because I never met Emily anywhere, never sent a single photo I wouldn't have shown my own mother, never did anything beyond typing back and forth some nights when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep and Carol was working a late shift at the hospital. I told myself a lot of things that year to make the shape of what I was doing feel smaller than it was. I found out what I'd actually been doing on a Thursday night in October, standing in our kitchen with my phone in one hand and Carol's old laptop open on the counter in front of me, staring at a browser history that didn't belong to the wife I thought I knew. And by the time I finished putting the pieces together, I understood that the entire year of messages I'd been trading with a woman named Emily Hart, a woman who knew things about me no stranger should have known, who used phrases my own wife used, who once even referenced a scar on my hand from a nail gun accident I'd never mentioned on the app at all, had never been a stranger in the first place. I'll get to that kitchen counter. I have to tell you how we got there first, because the year leading up to it matters more than the discovery itself, and because I think there's a version of me in that story who deserved to catch it sooner than I did. Carol and I had built, by most outward measures, a good marriage. 13 years, a daughter we both adored, a modest brick house on the east side of Tulsa that we'd slowly made our own one weekend project at a time. I worked long hours during storm season, adjusting claims after every hailstorm that rolled through Oklahoma, and Carol worked long hours managing a surgical unit that never seemed to slow down, and somewhere in the overlap of our two exhausting schedules, we'd settled into a rhythm that felt, most days, like enough. If I'm honest about my own contribution to what came later, it starts here, with a blind spot I'd carried into the marriage and never fully examined. I have always needed to feel useful, needed, admired in some small, specific way that my actual daily life, full of denied claims and disappointed policyholders, rarely provided. Carol used to tell me, half joking, that I lit up more talking to strangers about their busted roofs than I did talking to her about our own day, and I laughed it off every time instead of hearing what she was actually telling me. The Spark Connect messages filled something I hadn't admitted was empty. Emily asked questions about my work that made it sound interesting again. She remembered details from one conversation to the next, circled back to things I'd mentioned weeks earlier, made me feel, in the particular currency I'd always been hungriest for, genuinely interesting. I told myself this was just flattering, not dangerous, because I never once considered leaving Carol over it. I understand now that danger doesn't always look like wanting to leave. Sometimes it just looks like needing somewhere else to be fully seen, and finding it easier to build that somewhere else than to ask for it at home. Carol, meanwhile, was going through changes of her own that I mostly missed, wrapped up as I was in my own quiet, guilty correspondence. She started keeping her phone closer than she used to, angled face down on nightstands and counters in a way that hadn't been her habit before. She'd glance at it during dinner sometimes, and something would pass over her face. Not quite worry, not quite anything I could name, before she'd tuck it away and return to the conversation like nothing had happened. I didn't ask, not because I didn't notice, but because asking would have meant opening a door I wasn't ready to open myself, given what was sitting on my own phone. I told myself her behavior meant nothing, the same way I told myself mine meant nothing, and the two of us moved through that spring like a pair of people each quietly guarding something, neither aware the other one was doing the exact same thing from the opposite direction. There was a night in March when Carol asked me, apropos of nothing, whether I still found her interesting. An odd, vulnerable question that came out of a silence at the dinner table rather than any argument. I remember feeling a flash of guilt so sharp it must have shown on my face, because she looked at me a beat too long afterward, like she was waiting for something I didn't give her. I told her of course I did, and changed the subject, and went upstairs later that night to check my messages from Emily with a discomfort I didn't examine closely enough to stop. Looking back now, that dinner table question was the loudest thing either of us said to each other that whole spring, and I let it pass like static. Lily, 10 years old and sharper than either of us gave her credit for, started commenting on how much time both her parents spent on their phones. A fairly ordinary kid complaint, except she said it with a specific edge one evening that stuck with me longer than it should have. "You're both always texting somebody," she said, not looking up from her homework, in the flat, observational way kids deliver their most accurate insights. Neither Carol nor I responded to that directly. We both just put our phones down for the rest of the evening, a small, silent agreement neither of us acknowledged making. By early summer, the messages with Emily had become something I looked forward to in a way that embarrassed me even as I did it. Not because of anything explicit passing between us, but because of how easy it felt compared to the effort real intimacy required. Emily never seemed tired the way Carol sometimes was after a double shift. Emily never brought up the mortgage or Lily's dentist appointment or the leak in the garage roof I kept meaning to fix. Emily was, in every way that mattered, curated, though I didn't yet understand by whom or why. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever built a second, easier version of connection somewhere quieter than your real life, somewhere nobody asks anything hard of you, you already understand exactly how something like this starts, and exactly how long you can convince yourself it isn't really anything at all. The first real crack in my understanding of that year came from something small and strange, a phrase. Emily used the expression, "well, bless it," the same specific way, in the same specific rhythm, that Carol always had. A small regional turn of phrase from Carol's grandmother in Muskogee that I'd never heard anyone else use exactly that way. The first time Emily typed it, in July, I noticed it the way you notice any odd coincidence. Briefly, then not at all, filing it under the general category of strange things that happen and mean nothing. Then it happened again in August, and a third time in September, always in a context that fit naturally enough that I could explain it away each time. Maybe it was a more common phrase than I'd realized. Maybe Carol had picked it up from her grandmother's side of the family, which was scattered widely enough across Oklahoma that others might carry the same expression. I called it a coincidence then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. Carol's own behavior kept escalating in its own quiet way that summer, each sign a little louder than the one before it, though I kept misreading every single one. She started asking, in a tone she clearly meant to sound casual, whether I'd been talking to anyone new, a phrase specific enough that it should have stopped me cold and didn't, because some part of me heard it as a general check-in rather than the precisely aimed question it actually was. She started coming to bed later some nights, her face lit blue in the dark when I woke briefly and saw her still on her phone, and when I asked what she was doing, she said, "just scrolling," a phrase so unremarkable I never thought to question it. There was an evening at Lily's soccer game where Carol excused herself twice within 20 minutes to take a work call, returning both times with a tightness around her eyes that I noticed, and then, true to the pattern I'd built all year, dismissed as hospital stress. I didn't ask what the calls were about. Some part of me, I understand now, had a vested interest in not looking too closely at anyone's phone that summer, mine included. Emily, meanwhile, began asking more specific, more personal questions as the months went on, not suspicious exactly, but oddly precise in a way I only recognized in hindsight. She asked once whether I ever regretted not telling my wife certain things, a strange, loaded question for a stranger on a dating app to ask, And I remember typing out a careful, half-honest answer about how every marriage has its private rooms, and feeling, as I typed it, a discomfort I didn't investigate. She told me, much later, what those months actually looked like from the other side of that phone screen, something I want to share here, because it reframes everything I thought I understood about that summer. I told myself I was only doing it to protect us, the first time I created that profile. I'd found a receipt from a hotel bar the year before that Harold couldn't fully explain, something innocent it turned out to be, a client dinner that ran long. But the fear it triggered in me didn't care about the innocent explanation. It just sat there afterward, low and constant, the way fear does when it's been given a reason to exist once before, years earlier, with someone else entirely. I built Emily to test him, at first. Just once, I told myself. Just to see. And when he responded the way he did, warmly, easily, more openly than he'd talked to me in longer than I wanted to admit, I told myself I needed to keep watching, that stopping now would mean not knowing, and not knowing had already cost me one marriage before Harold, back before he ever knew me, back when I was 26 and married to someone who lied to my face for 2 years while I stood there believing every word. I couldn't stop, once I started. Every night he talked to Emily instead of me confirmed something I already feared and somehow also needed confirmed, over and over, like picking at a wound to prove it still hurt. That's what she told me. I had no idea, that whole summer, that the woman I thought was quietly slipping away from me was actually sitting 3 feet away every single night, watching me slip towards someone who didn't exist. By September, the small inconsistencies had accumulated into something with real weight, even though I still hadn't assembled them into a shape I was willing to look at directly. Carol's questions about talking to anyone new had become more frequent and more pointed. Emily's phrasing had started echoing Carol's so consistently that I'd begun, without fully admitting it to myself, keeping a mental list. The detail that finally broke through arrived almost by accident. On a Sunday afternoon in early October, when Carol asked to borrow my phone to check something about our shared calendar, and I handed it over without thinking, forgetting for one careless second that Spark Connect was still open in a background tab. She didn't say anything. She handed the phone back a moment later, calendar pulled up exactly as she'd asked, her face giving away nothing at all. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I understand now that she'd just watched me hand her, without knowing it, the exact evidence she'd spent a year quietly gathering the opposite direction. The turn came, as these things so often do, entirely by accident. I wasn't investigating anything that Thursday night in October. I was looking for a recipe Carol had saved on her old laptop for a dish Lily loved, planning to surprise them both with dinner, and in the process of searching through her browser bookmarks, I stumbled onto a folder labeled simply Family Docs that, when I clicked it out of idle curiosity, contained something entirely different than what its name suggested. A set of saved screenshots, dozens of them. Every one a message from a conversation on Spark Connect between Harold_T44 and Emily_H. My own messages. My own conversation, saved and organized by someone who had access to every word of it. For a long moment, I just stood there in the kitchen holding the laptop, feeling nothing at all. The flat, disorienting calm before the actual weight of something lands. I told myself there had to be an explanation that didn't mean what it obviously meant. Maybe Carol had somehow found my account and was simply documenting evidence of infidelity, building a case the way any hurt, suspicious spouse might. That explanation would have been bad enough on its own. It also turned out to be only half the story. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed to understand the full shape of what I was looking at before I said anything I couldn't take back, and something colder and more methodical than I recognized in myself took over. I went through the folder systematically after Carol had gone to bed, cross-referencing dates, and that's when I found the second thing, a set of admin login credentials for the Spark Connect account itself, saved in Carol's password manager under an entry labeled, with what I can only now read as a kind of exhausted honesty, the test. I sat at our kitchen table for a long time after that, the login credentials glowing on the screen, understanding slowly, sentence by sentence, that Emily Hart had never been a real woman testing my loyalty from the outside. She had been my own wife, testing it from the inside, for the better part of a year. Every apparent lead I might have chased that night collapsed the moment I actually looked at it. This wasn't a stranger who happened to know things about me. This wasn't a coincidence of phrasing. This was 13 years of marriage compressed into a fake profile, built and maintained with a patience that genuinely frightened me once I understood the scope of it. I realized then that I hadn't spent a year being deceived by a stranger. I'd spent a year being studied by my own wife, while simultaneously deceiving her myself. Two parallel betrayals running side by side in the same house, without either of us fully seeing the others. I had spent months telling myself my own behavior was harmless because nothing real was happening, and now understood that Carol's fear, however she'd chosen to act on it, hadn't been baseless paranoia at all. I had given her something real to be afraid of. I just hadn't expected to discover that she'd built an entire second identity to confirm it. I photographed the folder, the login page, the password manager entry, with the same clinical distance I'd used a decade earlier documenting hail damage on a roof. A professional habit turned, in that moment, towards something that didn't fit any claim form I'd ever filed. I didn't say anything to Carol that week. I watched her make Lily's lunch on Tuesday morning, watched her laugh at something on the radio driving to school drop-off, and some part of me that used to simply love watching that now watched it with a strange double vision. The wife I knew, and the architect of Emily Hart, occupying the same body at the same kitchen counter. There was a moment that same week I only understood the full shape of much later, one that ran in uneasy parallel to everything I was quietly discovering. The Tuesday Herald started acting strange, quieter, watching me a beat too long over breakfast. I felt something tighten in my chest that told me he'd found something, though I didn't yet know what or how much. I sat in the hospital parking lot before my shift that morning, phone in my lap, actually composing a message to delete the entire Spark Connect account before he could discover it, my thumb hovering the same way as would, weeks later, over that trash icon. I didn't send it. I told myself I needed more time to decide how to end this on my own terms, that deleting it now, mid-confrontation that hadn't happened yet, would look exactly like what it was: panic, guilt, a woman caught. I told myself I could still control how this came out. I understand now that I'd already lost that control the moment I handed him back his phone with the app still open, whether I'd realized it in the moment or not. That's what she told me. I didn't know it that Tuesday. Watching her seem distracted over coffee, that 40 minutes away, she'd come within 1 cent message of erasing the whole thing herself. I waited until Lily was at a sleepover the following Friday before I laid it out, because whatever was about to happen in our kitchen, I didn't want our daughter anywhere near the sound of it. I didn't yell. I set my laptop on the table, opened to the screenshot folder, the password manager entry beside it on my phone, and I said, "I need you to explain Emily Hart to me." Carol went very still, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math behind an otherwise composed face. "It's not what it looks like," she said, which is, I've come to understand, the sentence almost everyone reaches for first, regardless of how accurate or inaccurate it turns out to be. "Then tell me what it looks like." She said it started as a joke, something she'd set up on a whim after a conversation with a coworker about how easy it was to catch a cheating spouse online, that she'd never expected me to actually respond, that once I did, she kept it going out of morbid curiosity more than anything else. I asked why there was a full year of saved screenshots, organized by date, if it was only ever a joke. She said she liked keeping records, that it was just her nature as someone who managed hospital documentation for a living. I placed my phone beside the laptop, the password manager entry labeled "The Test" visible on the screen, and asked what exactly she'd been testing. She shifted again, said maybe it had started as more than a joke, that she'd been anxious after finding an unexplained hotel receipt the year before, that the whole thing had just been a way to reassure herself I wasn't doing anything wrong, and that in a strange way my responses to Emily had actually reassured her, because I'd never crossed any real line. I asked her to explain, then, why an entire year of reassurance required a fake identity engineered around specific personal details, a saved evidence folder, and administrative credentials hidden under a label that plainly called it a test rather than a joke. Each time she shifted her explanation, I laid another piece of what I'd found on the table between us. The credentials, a printed timeline of matching phrases, the exact date she'd held my phone with the app open in the background, And I watched a woman I'd spent 13 years with run out of room to reframe what was sitting in front of both of us. I didn't raise my voice. I felt something in me go very quiet instead, colder than anger, the particular stillness of understanding that the story I'd been living inside for a year had never been the story I thought it was. I need you to stop reframing this, I said finally, and just tell me why. All of it, from the actual beginning, not the version that makes it sound smaller than it was. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the evidence spread across our kitchen table like something she'd been asked to identify. Then, in a voice that had lost the defensive edge from a few minutes earlier, she said, "Okay, but there's something else you need to know first, something that happened long before either of us knew each other. That actually explains why I built her in the first place." She told me then about her first marriage, at 26, to a man named Peter, something she'd mentioned to me only in passing over the years, always briefly, always with a closed-door tone I'd learned early on not to push against. What she'd never told me was the specific shape of how it ended. 2 years of Peter lying to her face about an affair she'd suspected and repeatedly been told, calmly and convincingly, she was imagining. By the time she found undeniable proof, she said, she'd started to doubt her own judgment so completely that she questioned whether she could trust her own instincts about anyone, ever again. "That's the wound Emily actually came out of," she said. "Not you, Peter. I built her because some part of me has never fully believed I'd recognize betrayal again until it was already too late, and I needed proof, constantly, that this time was different. I know that's not fair to you. I know what I did instead was become the thing I was so afraid of." The revelation didn't excuse the year of surveillance, and she didn't ask me to treat it as if it did, but it reframed the entire shape of what I thought I'd walked into that kitchen to confront, replacing a story about calculated deception with something closer to a woman still bracing, 13 years later, against a wound she'd never let either of us properly examine. She finally spoke again. After a long silence neither of us moved through quickly. This is what she told me next, as close to her words as 2 years of distance lets me hold them. "It started the week I found that hotel receipt, the one that turned out to be nothing. I told myself building the profile was just precaution, not betrayal. That watching wasn't the same as lying, even though I now understand it absolutely is. The first message I sent as Emily, I told myself it was harmless curiosity, one message, just to see if you'd respond at all. When you did, warmly, easily, I told myself I needed just one more conversation to be sure, and then one more after that, for almost a year. I used my grandmother's phrases without meaning to. They're just how I talk, and I forgot Emily was supposed to be someone else entirely, which should tell you how thin the wall I'd built around her really was. I couldn't look at you some mornings, making coffee, without a specific kind of shame settling into my chest. Not because you were doing anything wrong with Emily, but because I was the one lying, every single day. While quietly judging you for a betrayal, I was the one actually committing. I almost deleted it in September, sitting in the hospital parking lot. I don't have a clean reason why I didn't, beyond the fact that stopping meant admitting how far past reasonable I'd let this go, and admitting that felt harder than continuing." That's what she told me. I sat with it for a long time afterward, holding two true things at once. That what she'd built was a real violation of 13 years of trust, and that the fear underneath it was real too, inherited from a wound that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with how she'd learned, at 26, that her own judgment couldn't be trusted. I didn't sleep in our bedroom that night. I sat on the back porch until the sky started going gray, turning over both halves of what I now understood, my own year of quiet, easy conversations with a woman I believed was real, and Carol's year of quiet, methodical surveillance built out of a fear she'd never let either of us look at directly. I moved into my brother's spare room the following week, not as a dramatic gesture, but because I genuinely needed distance to think clearly about what 13 years actually meant against what this year had revealed about both of us. Carol didn't fight the space. She started seeing a therapist within that same month, on her own, unprompted by any ultimatum from me. Something I only learned about because Lily mentioned it, the easy way kids report the ordinary facts of their lives. Carol lost something real in all of this that no amount of explanation could fully restore, the specific, easy confidence I used to have that whatever version of her I was talking to at any given moment was actually her. That kind of trust, once punctured this precisely, doesn't simply reinflate because the reasons behind the puncture turn out to be sympathetic. She understood this herself, I think, better than I did in those first weeks. She never once asked me to simply move past it, only asked for the chance to show, over time, that she could become someone who brought her fear to me directly instead of building elaborate architecture around it in secret. For my own part, I had to sit with an uncomfortable accounting of what I'd actually done that year, separate from anything Carol had done to me. I had built my own quiet second life inside a phone, however chaste it technically remained, because it was easier than asking my own wife to make me feel the way Emily had. I understood, sitting on my brother's spare bed some nights turning all of this over, that I had spent years being good at the wrong things too, at seeking easy validation instead of harder intimacy, at needing to be admired rather than needing to be truly known, mistaking the first for a substitute for the second. We spent 4 months apart while both of us worked, separately, with our own therapists, on the specific patterns that had let this year happen at all. I came back to the house in February, not because enough time had passed to simply forget any of it, but because both of us, independently, had done enough work to make a real conversation possible instead of another round of reframing and defense. Carol asked me once, that spring, whether I could ever fully trust her again, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet. That trust wasn't a door that swings back open on a single hinge just because both people want it to. What I could tell her, and did, was that I was willing to keep building it back slowly, in view of each other this time, rather than in whatever separate quiet corners either of us had been building things before. I used to think a good marriage meant two people who never needed anything outside of it. I understand now that the danger was never needing something more. It was choosing to build that something secretly instead of asking for it out loud, at the exact moment the asking would have cost us both the least. Carol's fear didn't disappear because she named its origin. It just finally had somewhere honest to go instead of a fake profile built at midnight in a hospital parking lot. If you've ever built a quieter, easier version of connection somewhere your real relationship couldn't see, or watched someone you love pull away and told yourself it meant nothing rather than asking the harder question, I think you understand exactly what that kitchen table felt like, evidence spread out between two people who'd each been keeping their own kind of secret. Lily asked me once, months later, in the specific unguarded way only a 10-year-old can manage, whether her mom and I were happy again. I told her we were working on being honest again, which felt truer than happy, and she seemed to accept that answer with more grace than either of her parents had managed to give each other for most of that year. There's a particular symmetry sitting at the center of this story that took me longer than it should have to see clearly. Two people, married 13 years, each quietly building an easier, safer version of connection in the exact same house at the exact same time. Each one convinced their own version was the harmless one, and the other's was the real betrayal. What this story ultimately reveals isn't really about a fake dating profile, or even about surveillance as a category of behavior. It's about what happens when fear and loneliness are never spoken aloud, and instead get engineered into something that looks, from a distance, like control, but functions underneath as a desperate kind of testing. Carol's fear traced back to a marriage that predated Harold entirely, a 2-year deception from a previous husband that had taught her, at 26, that her own instincts about betrayal couldn't be trusted, and rather than bringing that wound into the marriage where Harold could help carry it, she built an entire secret architecture to manage it alone, which only deepened the very isolation the fear had originally come from. Harold's blind spot runs its own parallel thread, a need for admiration so specific and so long unexamined that a stranger's curated attention on an app felt, for a full year, like an acceptable substitute for asking his own wife to see him more fully. The dinner table moment where Carol asked whether he still found her interesting stands as the story's clearest missed turning point, precisely because it was the one instance where the real question was asked directly, out loud, and still slid past unanswered. The real hinge of this story isn't the discovery of the folder at all, but the revelation about Peter that followed it. The moment a story Harold had built about calculated deception got reframed into something sadder and more complicated, a portrait of inherited fear that didn't cancel the harm, but changed what kind of repair was actually possible. That collision, between real accountability and real compassion for where the behavior came from, is where whatever wisdom this story holds actually lies. What lingers longest is the suggestion that the specific danger here was never distance itself, but the silence both partners built around that distance instead of naming it while there was still time to name it cheaply. The detail I keep coming back to is Carol in that hospital parking lot, phone in her lap, one message away from deleting everything herself weeks before I found it, and choosing not to send it. I think about how differently this whole year might have gone if either of us had simply said the harder, more honest thing out loud instead of building something quieter and more controllable around it. I've stopped asking whether I could have caught it sooner. The more honest question, I think, is why it felt safer for both of us to build separate secret worlds than to risk one uncomfortable conversation in the world we actually shared. If there's a fear in your own life that's ever gotten inherited from somewhere else entirely and quietly reshaped how you love the person right in front of you, I'd like to hear the one word you'd use for that fear, or for the moment you finally recognized it. Drop it in the comments. And to whoever stayed with me through this whole story, thank you, genuinely, for sitting with something messier than a simple villain and a clean ending. I think most marriages are closer to this kind of mess than any of us like to admit, and I'm grateful you were willing to look at it anyway.